The X Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell is largely an opinion talk show. All opinions, comments, or statements of fact expressed by Rob McConnell's guests are strictly their own and are not to be construed as those of the X Zone Radio Show or endorsed in any manner by Rob McConnell, rel-mar McConnell Media Company, the X Zone Broadcast Network, its affiliated networks, stations, employees, or advertisers.
All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
And welcome back, everyone. This is the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell, coming to you from our broadcast center and studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. If you would like to send me an email, xzone@xzoneradiotv.com, on all social media sites, X-Zone Radio TV. And to find out about the programming we have available for you 24/7, 365 on the X Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net. My guest this hour, X Zone Nation, is Raymond Szymanski, and he's an award-winning author and researcher. Raymond is currently the undisputed expert on Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and its heralded connection to extraterrestrials. In his 2016 published book, 50 Shades of Grey, Evidence for Extraterrestrial Visitation to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and Beyond, Szymanski reveals a myriad of photographic evidence he has personally taken and factual information he has developed from that supports long-held rumors of Wright-Patterson's alien involvement. As a 40-year employee of the legendary Air Force Base, Raymond has unique first-person access to locations and individuals with information that eludes other accomplished researchers regardless of their pedigree. Joining me now is Raymond Szymanski. And Raymond, welcome to the X Zone.
Hey, thanks, Rob. Just delighted to be here.
Well, we're super glad that you're here, my friend. Tell us a little bit about yourself and where your interest in extraterrestrials comes from.
The first week that I was a co-op student at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base was January of 1973. Mm-hmm. And I had a mentor who was assigned to me that I write about in the book. And I call him Corvette Al because he would not permit me to use his last name for reasons I'll explain later. So he said, hey, look, you're the new guy. I'm going to show you where the Greasy Spoon Cafe is. And it was out our building through this dark, unused hangar and into another section of this very large complex. Mm-hmm. And as we stepped into this very empty, dark hangar, he turns to me and said, have you heard about our aliens? And I know I'm a kid from Detroit, I'm 19. I didn't know aliens. So I said, what do you mean? He goes, yeah, there was a crash out west and they brought the aliens machine and the aliens here for evaluation. And I said, oh, really? He said, yeah. He said they keep them in the tunnels. And to which I replied, we have tunnels? Imagine, this is my first week at a place that has over 600 buildings and 8,000 acres.
Wow.
So the conversation went on, and I said, well, can we go see these aliens in the tunnels? He said, no. Well, why not? Well, because it's a secret. And I had to laugh. I said, well, if it's a secret, how do you know about it?
Exactly.
And he said, well, everybody knows about it. It's kind of a general population secret. So, I learned more and I asked folks about it. But in 1973, Blue Book had already been there for over 20 years. So everyone was knowledgeable about the connection between Wright-Patterson and the Roswell crash wreckage, which actually was taken there and was evaluated there. So I think it was just one of those, we know Wright-Pat's connected to aliens, and our belief is that they're hidden somewhere on base, maybe not necessarily in the tunnels. And that's where it all started.
Fascinating. If somebody would have asked me if I seen the aliens being from Detroit, I would have said, sure, the Canadians come across the bridge all the time.
That's right.
Yeah.
For cheap shoes, they're shopping at Sears.
That's right. That's right. Not to mention the cheap booze as well. What do you think's going to happen with the trade war between Canada and the United States now? Isn't that stupid?
I'm actually living in a dark hole in my basement, so I don't really watch the news. I don't watch national news. I don't watch local news. And, you could tell me that we were at a real war with each other. I honestly wouldn't be aware of it.
You're a very smart man. You're a photojournalist.
Yes.
How does this tie into your book?
A lot of the books you'll find are just nothing but narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be nice to get a little, evidence to kind of visualize what's going on and sink your teeth into it. So when I say I was with Travis Walton at the site of his abduction on this day in 2015, I have a photograph of myself and Travis Walton at his abduction site on that date published in the book. And I do that for just about everything because I think it adds credibility. And it says, hey, if you don't agree with me or you think I'm blowing smoke, well, here's my best evidence. Go ahead and try to refute it. And I find that a lot of folks are telling stories in their books. And I've actually called out a couple of authors and pointed out stories that I knew were false. And they just kind of blew me off. But, in one case, it was a story about a person who was actually my boss at Wright-Patterson, and I called the co-authors on it, and they just went, oh, well, we had a source, and he was unreliable, and did they do anything about it? No. So I like to put some extra evidence in there to build the credibility of the stories that I tell in the book.
Why did you write a book about UFOs? You could have written a book about so many other things. Was it the direct connection with Wright-Patterson?
I had been reading and researching this topic for decades, and I started to visit, back in about 2005, I started to visit a number of the famous UFO sites just as a curiosity to kind of go, okay, I want to poke my fingers into this thing. I want to see if I can find some new witnesses, maybe some old witnesses, some older new evidence. I wanted to convince myself that the stories that I'd been hearing for decades on the base had some substance to them.
Did you find a connection in between all those locations that you visited? Was there, being there, taking the photographs that you have, is there a connection? Or are these just sporadic locations where these extraterrestrial events took place?
Well, let's look at 3 of the 4 stories that I investigate. I investigate the 1965 Exeter, New Hampshire, 1975 Travis Walton, and 1980 Rendlesham Forest. So in the first instance, I went to Exeter, and in the book, Incident at Exeter, written by John Fuller, famous book about it, I actually was able to find through my own research and some clues in the book, the site, the actual site where Norman Muscarello in September of 1965 saw a 90-foot UFO hovering over this farmhouse. So I go to this farmhouse, and who answers the door but the son of the man who owned the farm during the time that John Fuller wrote his famous book. And at the time, this guy was 80 plus years old, and he toured me around the farmhouse and pointed the area over the house and the garage and said, that's where Norman saw the 90-foot UFO.
Wow. That
rock wall over here is where he dove behind. Took me to the back property and said, this is where the UFO was hiding out during the day. So I found that the connection, there was always a witness who would talk to me, even though, they had gotten it secondhand. He obviously wasn't out there with Norman.
Sure. And
I did that for everything. Of course, I went to Travis Walton's site with Travis, and I went to Rendlesham Forest to investigate, and I've had personal conversations with some of the key players, including Colonel Halt and John Burroughs of the famous Rendlesham incident.
But isn't there a discrepancy in the Rendlesham Forest on how it was actually put together in the book?
Well, it depends on what book you're talking about. If you're talking about Left at Eastgate, there's a lot of controversy there because many people, including Colonel Halt, who was the deputy base commander,
right.
he says Larry Warren, who is one of the co-authors of the book, wasn't there.
Yeah.
He did not participate, and he got his stories through everybody else. But the story that Halt, Burroughs, Peniston, Cabansag, the guys that were out there those nights and were basically on duty, their stories are immutable, and for the most part, they sync up.
Yeah, I remember Holt being on a different perspective with Kevin Randall, and Kevin, bringing that topic up. Do you find this happens a lot in ufology?
That what happens a lot.
There's a lot of contradiction even in between the alleged people who are part of the case.
Well, let's take Rendlesham. I've had healthy conversations with Colonel Halt and John Burroughs, and I've communicated with Jim Peniston via email, and their stories fully sync up. I've read the book that Burroughs, Peniston, and Nick Pope put together. It jives with everything I've heard. It's a very, very consistent story, and there's too many witnesses. There are
all right.
dozens and dozens.
You and I have to take our
witnesses.
commercial break. Please stand by. Exo Nation, our guest this hour is Raymond Szymanski, and his website is www.itsaufo.wixsite.com. We'll both be back on the other side of this break as we continue here in the X Zone from our broadcast center and studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Don't go away. Welcome back, everyone. Raymond Szymanski is our special guest this hour. His website is itsaufo.wixsite.com, and he's the author of 50 Shades of Grey, Evidence of Extraterrestrial Visitation to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and Beyond. Before we went to the break, we were talking about, I was talking about inconsistencies, and you were telling us about the consistencies that you found in the Rendlesham Forest case.
Yes. Again, I've had a wonderful opportunity to actually speak with two of the principals and communicate somewhat extensively through email with the third, and all the material is pretty consistent. But there is some inconsistencies between what Larry Warren and his co-author wrote in Left at Eastgate and the story of the folks who have the records and can prove that they were actually out in the forest that night. Larry has some evidence to show that he was on the base, but it seems like nobody's vouching for him actually being there. And his co-author has recently disavowed him and said, I was fooled for decades, and now I realize that Larry was not being forthright, and I can no longer back his story. I'm not passing judgment on Larry Warren or Left at Eastgate, and I really, really enjoyed the book, but there has been some facts apparently coming out that prove that the book Left at Eastgate probably has a few things that were fabricated by the authors.
What does that do to the UFO community and other UFO authors like yourself?
Well, I think it casts a shadow on us because, I myself have found reputable researchers. I'm talking people who do every weekend. They're out at a conference and they're a headliner. And, a couple of them, I've pointed out errors in the book of fabrications or just, sloppy research.
Sure.
And they don't, it's like, hey, we're selling books, shut your mouth. And, so I haven't really made it public. But for those people, I personally have lost respect for them. And there's others that I know are high integrity, and those are the people that I tend to hang with or I tend to communicate with. So, it's not all bad, but, they should clean up their act a little bit. And I think it maybe will cast a shadow on the rest of us.
All right. You gave us 3 stories, the Exeter, the Travis Walton abduction case, and Rendlesham Forest. On each one of the cases, based on the research that you have done, what are your conclusions? Let's take Exeter. Was it a UFO?
There's no doubt. When you take into consideration the first night with Norman Muscarello, who not only saw it once, but he saw it twice. The second time he saw it, he was in the company of 2 police officers, David Hunt and Eugene Bertrand. So it's a no-brainer. The police officers had absolutely no reason to say, gee, Scratch Tolan was their desk officer. Gee, Scratch, we were out there and we saw this UFO. In fact, the moment they saw it, Bertrand got on the walkie-talkie and was communicating back to the desk, and he goes, Scratch, I see the damn thing myself. And then, in the book, there were dozens and dozens of witnesses that were being interviewed by John Fuller. So, that's a slam dunk. Okay. If you look at Travis Walton, he had 6 people in the truck the moment they saw the 30-foot craft that eventually zapped Travis and took him away for 5 days. They all passed multiple lie detector tests flawlessly. There was one inconclusive, and there was a reason for that. This one guy was in trouble, and he thought he was going to go to jail. But Travis's story has never changed. He has written one of the finest books ever, The Fire in the Sky, especially the last 100 pages, which debunks all the debunkers. And he goes into the story of how guys like Philip Klass tried to change the story and, make life miserable for Travis. Read those 100 pages and you will come away with a fabulous appreciation of, Travis's story. And then Rendlesham, I talked to the participants and I've communicated with others. Clearly, 24 security police and senior officers in the U.S. Air Force would not concoct a story about a UFO. In fact, you would expect just the opposite, that they would deny it to the end, to their grave. But that's not the case. So for me, it was a journey of, I wanted to poke holes in these stories, and I didn't care which way it came out. If I found people were lying or the evidence was being fabricated or it just wasn't true, I was fine with that, but that didn't turn out to be the case.
Why do you think the officers involved in the Rendlesham case actually went public with it?
Colonel Halt actually didn't go public. He wrote a letter to the Ministry of Defense probably a couple weeks after it happened. I think there might have been like 10 or 12 days lapsed between the actual ending of the events and when the MOD got the letter. And it was highly classified, but there was a Freedom of Information Act request, and there was a failure on the part of the person who was processing it to realize what they were releasing. So it was pretty much a mistake. And once the Halt memo was public, then it was open. So it was never meant to be public, but once it happened, they all backed up their stories and said, yep, that's the way it went down.
Tell us about your MIB encounters.
Well, there's a organization here at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base that ran Project Blue Book, and it's called the Foreign Technology Division. Now it's called the National Air and Space Intelligence Center, or NASIC. So they have a different acronym. But back when it was FTD, they ran Project Blue Book, and it was supposed to be investigative, turned out to be more public relations. And of course, they do highly classified work. I mean, just the name Foreign Technology or National Air and Space Intelligence gives you the clue that they're doing important things that they're probably not going to tell the public about. Well, one day I was out on the golf course, which borders the building, and there was a gentleman who was in the shade of the tree, and I got into a conversation with him. He had the Men in Black suit. He had a hat on. the typical MIB hat. It was May, so it was super hot. And, in Dayton, we can get to the 90s easily in late May. So it was super hot, and he was just like totally not dressed for the weather. So I engaged him in this, hypothetical, are you a man in black and do you work there at this building, which, I know is the former FTD. And of course, he denied it, and we had this conversation. Well, months pass. And of course, my book is published. There's a long distance picture of him in there, and there's no way he can be ID'd from that. I got a communique from somebody who said, "Hey, I've got another picture of that guy. Would you like to have it?" And they sent it to me, and indeed, it's a picture of this guy actually walking into that building, and he is dressed precisely. Black hat, black tie, black coat. Now, is he a man in black?
Well, based on what he's wearing, sure he is.
Based on what he's wearing, walks like a duck, talks like a duck. He's most likely a duck. I honestly don't know. I've had people who work in that building or who know the individual have contacted me and said, "Read your book. I just want to tell you, I know he dresses weird, but I don't have any evidence of him being one of these intimidators that go out and try to hide evidence of UFOs that they're reputed to be doing." But then again, I just say, well, explain to me why the guy dresses like that. So the jury is still out, but, I've had this conversation. He's denied it. But when I look at him and I talk to him, my suspicions are raised significantly.
Earlier in this hour, you mentioned the tunnels beneath Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Have you ever gone into those tunnels, and have you, in fact, seen these crashed debris?
Absolutely, I've been in tunnels. And, we have vaults that go into tunnels and tunnels that go into vaults and every combination. I'm afraid I wasn't privileged enough to see any aliens, but they're mostly pedestrian connective tunnels, or they run heat pipes and electricity, right, and mostly utilities through the tunnels. Even though some of them you can literally walk through, so nothing sinister. And if you're at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, you know the reputation of the base. They do highly classified work. You would be shocked if they didn't have tunnels, if they didn't have vaults.
Well, of course, who wants the spy satellites from the other countries knowing what you're doing? It only makes sense.
Yeah, if that's yep, the purpose of the tunnels, that's fine. But the tunnels I've been in, I haven't really seen any research equipment sitting there in the pedestrian thoroughfare. Now, it may be in one of the vaults that's in that hallway, of course.
Stand by, my friend. You and I have to take our commercial break with the news at the bottom of the hour. Exonation, our guest this hour is Raymond Szymanski. And his website is www.itsaufo.wixsite.com. And I'll be back on the other side of this news break with Raymond as we continue talking about his book, 50 Shades of Grey, Evidence of Extraterrestrial Visitation to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and Beyond. This is the X Zone, a place where people dare to believe and dare to be heard, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality, Monday through Friday from 10 p.m. Eastern until 2 a.m. Eastern, here on the X Zone Broadcast Network, Mutual Broadcast Network, Talkstar Radio Network, Simul Radio, Simul TV, and iHeartRadio. Don't go away, we'll be back after the news. Welcome back, everyone. Our guest this hour is Raymond Szymanski. His website is itsaufo.wixsite.com. Your book's been endorsed by 4 world-class UFO researchers. Can you tell us a little bit about them and how they came to endorse your book?
When I first started attending the International UFO Congress, I tried to seek out the best people for their category. So, Nick Pope had his pulse on all things British. Yvonne Smith was one of the world's premier hypnotic regressionists. Paul Davids was very well known. He was a UFO Hall of Famer, well known for his work on the movie Roswell, and Preston Dennett for his work in undersea UFOs, but more specifically, his book UFOs over Topanga Canyon. So as I had the opportunity to meet them, I socialized with them, asked them a lot of intelligent questions, and communicated with them in between these conferences via email, sometimes via telephone. And the way that I got to actually, the moment that I decided to write the book on UFOs is I was at that Travis Walton site with Travis in February of 2015. And something just clicked where I said, I have all this good stuff, all this great information I think that needs to get out there. And the fact that Travis let me drive him in a 4x4 slip sliding through the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest on 3 inches of mud to go do a photo shoot and visit his site. I just felt at that moment that, I was part of this community. And one thing led to another. I gave the manuscript to these individuals. They read it. They gave me great comments, some criticisms, and eventually they just agreed to support the book. They thought it was great. It was, revealing. It's a UFO expose. It's a quest for the truth. It's a coming of age story. It's funny. And they just took to it. So they welcomed me with open arms, and I'm extremely grateful for their support.
I understand that you had your very own UFO encounter, experience, or sighting.
I did. And when I look at the path that the UFO was on. Now, I live only a few miles from the Air Force Base, Wright-Patterson, and I was coming back from a therapy appointment. I had a car accident in 2010, and I was coming back from a medical appointment, and I looked through, something caught my eye through the moonroof of my car, and I poked my head down through the windshield looking forward, and I saw a craft. It's hard to describe now, but somewhat scalloped with large lights like you would see on a 1960s era Chevrolet called cat eye lights. And I got about a 7-second view of this maybe 100-foot craft slipping into these clouds that were only about 75 feet off the deck that day.
Is it possible that this craft was an experimental craft?
Well, they don't fly experimental craft here at Wright-Patterson for the simple reason that the entire base is surrounded by communities. Literally, like the graveyard of Fairborn, Ohio, sits 1 inch on the other side of one of the fences at Wright-Patterson, and then Beaver Creek is next to the other one, and then Huber Heights, and it's totally surrounded, and there's no space to do that. And it's not one of those places. So, but if it is ours, if that craft is ours, then we ought to make it public, and we ought to point to it and tell the world, we own this, and if you mess with us, this is what you're going to get.
Why do you think there's a truth embargo in place when it comes to UFOs and ETs?
Wow. I really wish I had the answer to that. I'll speculate if you like.
Okay, please. Yeah.
The first thought that comes to my mind is we've got this carcass with technology that's so far advanced, and that we've been reverse engineering this carcass for decades.
But how do we know we actually have the carcass?
Well, we've recovered crafts, or there are, I guess, well-traveled stories about the material at Roswell that was recovered, and Aztec, and other locations that we've basically recovered these. So using that as a stepping off point, we'd analyze it, and we would actually try to exploit it. And there's a lot of narrative out there about, well, Bell Labs, and did they indeed get the material from Roswell seeded to them from Colonel Corso? He wrote the book Day After Roswell, and if you're familiar with that, Corso goes on to say, hey, a lot of the stuff that we're now using now, although it might be 10, 20, 30 years later, we gave these raw materials to these very smart companies, and they eventually figured out how to exploit it. And voila, now we had the transistor and the integrated circuit, and lasers and fiber optics and all those type of things that maybe we wouldn't have gotten to for another 100 years.
But isn't it also possible that these are actually discoveries made by humans and have nothing to do with ETs?
It's entirely possible. I have actually gone back to the folks in the U.S. Air Force that I knew personally that worked in my building, that brought companies like Texas Instruments out of the Stone Age with transistors and funded them to develop the first integrated circuits. And those people tell me, you know what? We did it ourselves. We didn't have any help.
Yeah.
Well, that may be true when they came on the scene, but if you look at the Bell Labs thing, Bell Labs was struggling for how to dope the transistor, what kind of chemicals to use so that they could control the electron flow in the transistor. And it wasn't until after the summer of 1947, when, of course, Roswell happened, that somebody got smart and says, oh, we need to use arsenic as a doping material, or whatever it was.
Sure.
And voila, they overcame this technical hurdle. Next thing you know, we've got a functioning transistor.
But
coincidence?
Yeah.
Not sure. Not sure.
There's a lot of circumstantial evidence with all of the UFO scenario, but when it comes to hard fact, hardcore evidence, there's very little.
I have to agree. There is a ton of narrative.
Yes.
There's a ton of depositions. And that's why there's researchers like myself, in the field with metal detectors, going to reputed crash sites, looking for something that might be testable.
So all these years that you've been going to crash sites, have you found any evidence?
Actually, I've only been going to crash sites for 2 years.
Okay,
and
2 years.
I currently don't have any test results that indicate that any materials that I either found myself or others have bequeathed to me show anything that I can pound my hand on the table and go, yeah, this is irrefutable. But there's always hope.
That's true. There's always hope. Why do so many people believe that the aliens are responsible for so many of modern day technology? I have a hard time wrapping my mind around that we would rather give credibility to aliens or spacecraft that nobody can prove actually exist, and take the glory and the good work done by many people.
Rob, all we needed was the knowledge of what chemical to use to dope the substrate, and the transistor was born. It was just a little clue, and we're off and running. And the same thing with everything else. No, the aliens didn't give us integrated circuits. No, they maybe didn't give us laser technology nor fiber optics, but there was enough clues there that we went, oh, well, if we can make one transistor, we can make 1 million of them. Oh, wait a minute, there's this thing here, it's silicon. Well, that's odd. What's that all about?
Okay.
So
I understand. I understand where you're going. I understand where you're going.
They just gave us the building blocks.
But we don't know that for a fact. That is a giant leap in supposition. And
I couldn't agree more.
And you know what? How do we know if somebody could travel across the galaxy through different universes? How do we even know that they need transistors? We're making a lot of suppositions here. And I think that this is what people are having problems with when it comes to the UFO community. Is it's a lot of smoke. But where's the fire?
No, there's really a lot of good, solid research there. I mean, let's look at the abduction phenomena. You have hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals with medical, clinical, psychological evidence that they bring forward. They say, look I had a pregnancy. I have a conscious recollection of creatures that I don't recognize. My neighbors saw the craft land in my backyard. There's radiological evidence. They burned the hole. The Geiger counter, went off the charts. 4 months later, I go to my gynecologist, and they cannot explain where the baby is.
All right, we're going to hold it right there because I've got to take my final break. Exonation, our guest this hour is Raymond Szymanski. His website, www.itsaufo.wixsite.com. And we'll wrap up this hour here in the X Zone from our broadcast center and studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, when we come back from this commercial break. I'm Rob McConnell. This is the X Zone. Don't go away. And welcome back. Our guest this hour is Raymond Szymanski, and we're talking to Raymond about his book. It's entitled 50 Shades of Grey, Evidence of Extraterrestrial Visitation to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and Beyond. His website is itsaufo.wixsite.com. Tell me, do you have a photograph of an actual UFO in your book?
I do not.
Then how can you call your book 50 Shades of Grey, Evidence of Extraterrestrial Visitation to Wright-Patterson?
It's actually, you've been mispronouncing it the entire show. It's actually 50 Shades of Greys. That's plural, G-R-U-I-S. And you've been using the singular, which tells me what kind of smut you've been reading.
Well, no, it's a typo. It's not the smut I've been reading. So all right. So tell me, evidence of extraterrestrial visitation to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and beyond. So where is the evidence in the book?
We're actually trying to dig that out. One of the things that I discuss in the book is the Adena Mound. Now, the ancient Adena Mound, the Adena culture here in the Miami Valley goes back about 3,000 years. And there's a very large Adena mound here on the base. The Adena, as a culture, the largest metallic object that they had was a copper axe head, which was probably about 5 inches in length. In the 1980s, early 90s, they did a non-intrusive, like ground penetrating radar and several other electrical conductivity tests to try to determine the stability, the disturbance level, and the contents of the Adena Mound. They were shocked to find multiple large metal objects that are about 2 foot by 2 foot in the Adena Mound that they cannot explain.
Why don't they just dig them up?
It's against the law, for one. It's actually a cultural heritage site, and despite the fact that that mound sits behind the fence in Area B of Wright-Patterson, it's protected and it's under the auspices of the National Park Service. So what happened is they just scratched their heads and they went away. I got the attention of some base authorities, and I said, there's an anomaly in there that you really need to investigate. And I sent them copies of my book, and in the book, I say, think for a minute if I were to take a coffin and I were to put a extraterrestrial that had been brought to Wright-Patterson, and I wanted to bury it in a place that could never be touched again. And I was going to do this kind of on the sly. And I would take that coffin, instead of putting it in horizontally, I would drop it in vertically. And now I've buried it in a place that nobody is ever going to investigate.
That's a nice theory, but on the other side, if you're going to get rid of an alien body, why not incinerate it and spread the ashes? Why chance something being found?
We could possibly do that. What I posit is that we would bury them and give them a Christian burial, because that's the way we do things on this planet. And if our astronauts were stranded on Mars or Saturn or some planet and they perished, we wouldn't want them permanently in a pickle jar. We'd want whoever's got them to respect them and, dispose of them, if you will, or caretake traditionally. So yeah, it's possible that they would do that. Maybe that's what's in there. Maybe that's just the ashes and it's a flat box, but nobody knows. But an exclusive for your radio show tonight is I know that they are going to revisit that site next year, and they're going to be doing a more extensive examination, non-intrusive, of that site, simply because I wrote something in my book.
Fascinating. Before the break, we started talking about alien abductions, and when we came back from the break, I kind of sidetracked. But I'd like to get back on that, if you don't mind. You were saying that there are thousands of people, and fetuses removed from the bodies. We've all heard these stories. But if this is happening and the authorities are doing nothing about it, what does that tell you?
They are incapable of doing anything about it. That's what that tells me.
Could it also be that there's nothing to investigate, that there are other explanations for what's going on?
I'm actually writing a trilogy, and that's another exclusive for your radio audience. The second book in the 50 Shades of Grey's trilogy is all about the abduction phenomena, and therein I am going to provide clinical, medical, and physical evidence of the phenomena.
Why are there not more medical personnel professionals? Because I don't classify a hypnotist as a professional in any category. I think they're sleight of hand artists in that they can actually get the person to talk about whatever they want to talk about. So I give hypnotism no credibility whatsoever.
When I tell Yvonne, boy, she is going to put the voodoo on you.
Well, you can tell her, and you can give her my number. I don't care. I think they're all a bunch of charlatans, a bunch of fakes, and I've told them this.
I'm sending her this recording.
No problem.
And I'm sure you will hear from her.
I don't care. I really don't. I'll tell her the same thing to her face. I
thought the same thing.
I don't believe it.
I thought the same thing. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate your take on it. I actually got to witness something. A film crew came in. I got invited to be a witness to this session, this regression session. And I can tell you that I was fascinated. I was floored. I was convinced. Of course, I've only seen one, but Yvonne's reputation procedure, she's done thousands of them. I've had extensive interaction with Dr. Leo Sprinkle, who's now retired. I've talked to multiple people who do this, Barbara Lamb, Dr. Jacobs, and once you talk to these people and see what they do, and
I've talked to these people.
You've got to come away with a different opinion.
I've talked to all of the people that you mentioned, and my opinion hasn't changed.
Well, that's okay. That's your position, and I respect that. And why you don't, that's your own choice.
Well, because the reason I don't is because there is never any evidence. It's all hearsay, nothing that is tangible, nothing that can provide evidence.
Well, what I already provided to you was, let's look at the scoop marks, for example. One of the very common type things are unexplained scoop marks, very deep retrievals, like a small mini spoon has been used to just gouge out a part of the shin or the calf or the arm.
Let me ask you.
I've seen them. People said, look at, my parents cannot explain it. I cannot explain it, but I can associate that with a conscious memory of being floated out the window of my home.
Okay, when was the last time a report of an alien abduction has come across, anybody's desk who's credible?
You mean, why isn't it on Fox News, or is that the question?
Yeah, how come the accredited news agencies don't report it anymore? Because they're sick of the mumbo jumbo.
Well, you could call it that, but I can tell you, I was recently on Fox and NBC, and they were very curious about the whole phenomena. I didn't get any like, oh, well, here comes Ray, Crazy Ray.
Yeah.
Well, Crazy Ray has got sterling, impeccable credentials and worked, for a research laboratory for the U.S. government for nearly 4 decades. So they were willing to listen to me, because I'm not claiming I'm being beamed up, and I don't believe I've ever been abducted, and I only had one sighting. So, as a scientist, I'm trained to investigate and sort through this stuff. And as you said, there is a lot of smoke here, and there is a lot of fire. And I really hope that someday the evidence that will convince you, is out there for your sake.
Well, it's not going to affect me either way. I think what it does is it perpetrates a lot of money for the UFO industry. I think that a lot of books are being sold, and I'm not, there's a lot of crap out there. And ever since the advent of the internet, in my opinion, is the largest septic tank that mankind has ever created, because there's more crap in it than there is anything else. Everybody's become an expert on everything. Anybody who has a little story to tell can fabricate it, blow it up, make it sensationalized. When a movie comes out from Hollywood, everybody's into the UFO genre. And, you take a look at Roswell, the Roswell Festival. That's a farce. It's a joke, for goodness sake. You've got a carnival atmosphere going on in a place that is abusing any credibility that is left of the Roswell case into a fair.
Everybody can be an expert, including radio show hosts.
Oh, I'm not an expert. Believe me, I'm not an expert. And I never claimed to be an expert. What I'm claiming is that a lot of these people in UFO world make no sense. They make no sense. They come up with a lot of theories. They come up with a lot of angles. But when it comes to the one thing that will give them any credibility, it's missing. And that is the evidence.
Are you familiar with the 1952 sighting over Washington, D.C., 2 consecutive weekends where they scrambled jets, and the blips were on radar screens at Andrews Air Force Base and the ground station at Washington National, and the jets chased after them, and the blips that were in the sky blinked out, and it was seen by hundreds of people. How about Rendlesham Force? You have a lieutenant colonel who's got a career to think about.
All right, we've got to say so long for tonight. Whoops.
This thing was over our head. It was beaming lights down at our feet.
We've got to say so long, so I want to thank you so much for coming on. It's a strange world out there. I agree with you. And one day I hope the truth is found. But until there's any evidence to the contrary, I'm sorry. I am not a believer. Skeptic? Yes. Believer? No. I'll be back. Don't go away.